Good evening, and it's that time again. It's Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host and the creator of Dead Sleep, Nancy Miller. And if you are new to the podcast, well, this is a true crime podcast made for people who like to unwind with a good mystery before bed, and you want a good story, not too loud, not too violent, with no big, blasting, obnoxious adverts, as they say in the UK, which is where tonight's episode takes place. Drawn from the real-life career of a fascinating woman I had the chance to interview when I was on a reporting trip to London back in 2022 for another true crime podcast. I didn't actually end up using her interview material, but I enjoyed speaking with her, and I followed her work ever since. Her name is Patricia Wiltshire, and she's a crime-fighting forensic expert with a unique expertise. Professor Wiltshire is a forensic ecologist who uses her deep knowledge about plant life and insects and microorganisms in the United Kingdom to solve the most puzzling criminal cases. Her job is to analyze the millions, billions of tiny, living clues. The plants, the pollen, the insects, the spores that reveal the hidden truth of a crime scene, that can tell the story of what happened, literally from the ground up. Evidence that can be more powerful than a fingerprint, and sometimes more definitive than DNA. A whole bustling, invisible world that we don't even see, that follows us wherever we go. Over her career, Professor Wiltshire, who is now in her early 80s, has used her knowledge as a forensic botanist to solve some of the UK's most notorious murder cases, and some more obscure but no less baffling ones too. I'm amazed there hasn't been like a BritBox series made about Pat Wiltshire, especially because her husband is a mycologist, which means he's an expert in fungi. And they sometimes team up together to crack unsolved murder cases with their most powerful weapon, a high-powered microscope. So tonight's episode is based on one of two cases in her most recent book that I found really fascinating and dead sleep-worthy. The book is titled The Natural History of Crime: Case Studies in Death and the Clues Nature Leaves Behind. And I'll link to it, of course, in the show notes. As always, there is no graphic violence in Dead Sleep. However, in this specific episode, someone does have an unfortunate run-in with a sharp object. You'll hear more about that tonight if you so choose. Just a heads up. So with that, let's settle in for the night. As we journey into the English countryside, it's that perfect kind of misty, chilly, foggy weather. And you have on your quilted Barber jacket, the one with the corduroy collar, or whatever jacket you choose. And you decide to head into a pub. Cheeks flush from the rainy, chilly night, and you're hit with the warmth of a fireplace. And you find a nice corner table where there's lots of people, clinking glasses, plenty of laughter, and you enjoy a pint, then another. Then another. Okay, let's just make it one more. Until suddenly, it's closing time. How did that happen? All of a sudden, all you really want to do is just go home and get in some comfy pajamas and fall asleep. That's what we can only assume an Englishman will call Rupert wanted when he left his local pub one fateful night not too long ago. Authorities would later note he was intoxicated, and his intoxication made him less aware of his surroundings and more vulnerable to the dangers out there. Even in a quiet, safe, small English town, because who knew really what lurked out there in the dark? Rupert certainly didn't. Rupert's wife stayed home that night. She didn't go to the pub. and she must have been a heavy sleeper because she didn't hear any sounds. No sounds of a violent struggle, nor screams, or of any breaking glass, or the heavy thump of someone heaving against the front door. Rupert's wife only woke up when it was too late, when it was in her room. When it was so dark, she thought it was a bear. This hulking shadow, snorting and huffing and groaning in the dark. No human features she could see. Just this giant thing lurching back and forth. But that was ridiculous. There hadn't been any bears in England in over 10,000 years. It had to be a man. But the sound this man made wasn't human. Not any human she recognized. What if it was some raging lunatic? She had two choices: stay in bed and try and fend him off and risk getting killed, or make an escape. And the only way she could do that, in this pitch-black room, would be if she could see. She clicked on the light. Oh, no. The raging, lurching maniac was her husband, Rupert. And she couldn't see what was wrong with him exactly, or which part of him was hurt. But what she could see was blood on his hands, smeared on his t-shirt. The most blood she could see was on his trousers. They were soaking in blood. Rupert's blood. His wife tried to ask him what happened, but Rupert was in so much pain, in shock, he could only moan, eyes rolling into the back of his head. When the medics came, they whisked him away so quickly, he'd lost so much blood every second counted. There was no time to ask what happened or who did it. It was a race against time to save his life. At the hospital, Rupert was rushed into an emergency room and into surgery immediately. It appeared he was the victim of a violent assault. Stabbed wasn't the word. He'd been speared, not just once, but twice, with a very long, very sharp object. And the location of the injury was the most twisted part. It appeared they came at him from behind and then speared him through the backside and up into his body. It was gruesome. It was intimate. And it was deadly. To do that kind of damage, the weapon was potentially, at a minimum, 2 feet. That's 60 centimeters long. What kind of weapon was it? And who would do such a thing? Detectives were obviously desperate for answers, but short on evidence. Their victim, that was Rupert, he'd had a lot to drink. He left the pub. After that, he couldn't remember a thing. Authorities were treating this incident as an attempted murder case. They began the appropriate protocols, canvassing the area, looking for a possible suspect, and retracing Rupert's steps from the pub to his walk home, step by step. There was no actual murder weapon, no sword of any kind, found in the home or on their property. The only potential clues detectives found were inside a greenhouse, located on Rupert's property. Inside the greenhouse, police found Rupert's phone and the belt to his trousers. Those items were arranged quite neatly, which added another strange dimension to the scenario. It appeared at first, because he was attacked from the back, that he might have been ambushed, surprised while he was walking home from the pub through a wooded area back to his house. But those items left inside the greenhouse suggested something more planned. It wasn't uncommon for a criminal who wanted to rob someone to instruct their target to remove items that they wanted, a phone, a wallet, and place those items on the ground so the criminal could collect them. But in this case, the victim's phone and his belt, they were all still there. What did this mean? Why would someone rob someone at knife point and tell them to put their items to the side, then brutally stab them, and then not even take the items? Granted, Rupert admitted he had had a lot to drink that night, but would he really not recall being accosted by someone in or near his own greenhouse, holding what had to be a 2-foot-long sword? And nobody heard anything? Nobody saw a guy walking around with a 2-foot-long sword? Then again, knife crimes weren't unheard of in the UK. They're the leading cause of homicides. There aren't many guns there, so knives are commonly used in a violent crime, from robberies to murders. And the definition of knife, it can mean a lot of things in England. There was a high-profile incident in London back in 2019 when a very brave and quick-thinking man managed to subdue a knife-wielding terrorist when he found a narwhal tusk on display on a wall and used the tusk to fight back against that terrorist. The narwhal tusk was an excellent choice. If you've never seen a narwhal, they're small whales found in the Atlantic Ocean, appropriately described as Arctic unicorns, because in the center of their heads, they have a very long, very sharp, skinny horn, which can grow up to 10 feet. That's just over 3 meters. But actually, the narwhal tusk is a tooth, and that tooth, it turns out, has nerve endings like human teeth. The narwhal tooth is believed to help detect ocean water conditions and considered essential for their survival. What wasn't essential in a small English town would be someone having a narwhal tusk on hand as a weapon. But there were any number of long, slim swords that someone might collect as a European or medieval history buff. And yet the scenario was just too strange, and the alleged attack so personal. It had to be someone Rupert knew, but who and why? To find that out, doctors dutifully took various samples from his wounds, and those samples revealed the weapon, somehow, was covered in organic matter. Traces of soil, leaves, maybe pollen, they didn't know. Was this weapon something the perpetrator had found near the greenhouse, a garden tool? If they could find out what that material was, what was left behind in those wounds, they could maybe find out where it all happened. And if they could find out where it happened, they could likely figure out the who. And to get those answers, authorities knew just who to call. Most murder investigations are solved using the 3 M's: motive, method, and means. For Professor Patricia Wiltshire, whenever she was asked to help with a case, she turned to her 3 M's: Mozart, a microscope, and her cat, Mickey. Mozart, that composer, got her brain moving. Her microscope brought the world into sharp focus. And Mickey, her cat, was her trusty, cozy sidekick. On that autumn day, when Pat received the call about the awful stabbing, she was horrified and intrigued. The detective on the other end said he wanted her to look at some samples they'd found on the man's injuries. They were looking at a possible attempted murder here, but the pieces weren't quite fitting together. He asked if he could send Professor Wiltshire the samples, the stuff that was swabbed from Rupert's wounds, and would she see if she could find anything? Could she identify what that organic material was? And maybe that would help them solve this case. Soon enough, the samples arrived, and Pat went to work. She put on her Mozart, got behind her microscope, with Mickey in arm's reach. Pat's work was tedious and painstaking. The organic material on these samples was so small. But after doing a bit of alchemy on these samples and pressing them into a slide and looking into them on a microscope, a whole world opened up. And as she described going through the slides and looking at each speck of pollen, and how together all of these specks became patterns that told a story. And the effect, at least how I envision it, is kaleidoscopic. I kept thinking about those old musicals, those old Busby Berkeley musicals, where the women are in the swimming pool and they all do this coordinated dance, like a synchronized water ballet, Hollywood style. And the whole thing is shot looking down. And in those old movies, it was always these bathing beauties in swimming caps, each individual forming altogether an extraordinary geometric pattern of movement. And I envisioned all of those pollen samples creating a pattern, looking down at them through Pat's microscope. And this kaleidoscope of all different kinds of pollens that were found on that man's injury, those told a story. And the story, at least what Pat saw, was peculiar. This kaleidoscope of pollen grains was supposed to tell Pat where this alleged murder attempt took place. The apparent attack against Rupert happened in the fall. So the pollen was a mix of stuff you'd find in the woods in autumn, like bits of pine, oak, and cherry trees. But there was also cultivated stuff you'd find in someone's garden or backyard, such as lime trees and rose bushes. This was unfortunate because detectives asked Pat to find out specifically where this happened. Was he potentially assaulted when he was walking through the woods to get home, or did it take place on his own property near that greenhouse? Then Pat realized this eclectic blend was a good thing, because it led her to the conclusion that this incident happened in a pretty specific place, along the edge of a wooded area, bordering a garden, which likely meant the apparent attack did indeed happen somewhere outside that greenhouse, on the border between Rupert's property and the woods. That made sense. But what didn't track yet was why there was so much pollen on the weapon, whatever it was. It was unlikely someone would, say, roll a sword in a bunch of grass, which meant it could be a garden tool. That it was a crime of opportunity, that someone maybe followed him home, then found some type of shears? Something else? Hidden, lying in the grass? Someone put it there carelessly? But what kind of garden tool could make that kind of injury? Which was pretty specific. Pat was herself a pretty avid gardener who took care of the plants and trees around her own house. There wasn't a garden tool that fit the profile of that weapon, though. Thin, sharp, and around 2 feet long. While examining the slides, Pat noticed one particular type of pollen sample that kept coming up. Pollen from a holly bush. When we think holly, we think the holidays, because of those signature spiky green leaves and red berries that are so signature to that time of year. But Pat knew what she was seeing in these slides was quite rare. Holly was like the Greta Garbo of pollen. It wasn't seen in public all that much and preferred to be alone. So holly grew all over the UK, but it's insect-pollinated, which means it doesn't spread through the wind. The pollen from those flowers doesn't travel very far. So what happened to Rupert didn't just take place near a holly plant. The criminal would have had to have maybe hid a sword or the weapon in the holly plant. How else to explain why there was so much pollen, especially this time of year, just before the holidays, which wouldn't be flower season, it would be pruning season. Pat thought about the satisfaction she derived from pruning in her own garden, cutting away all the dead or diseased parts, ensuring that come spring, things would bloom anew. The thing was about pruning a holly shrub, you had to cut the branches carefully at an angle. Because if you weren't careful, you could cut yourself on the spiny leaves, and those branches, once pruned, were razor sharp. Razor sharp. Pat phoned the detective, the one working Rupert's case. And she asked him to find out if Rupert had a holly bush, and if he did, had it been pruned recently? The cop looked into it, and he came back and told Pat, yes, there was a holly bush, and yes, it had been pruned recently. And that's pretty much when Pat revealed she'd cracked the case. Rupert, indeed, knew his assailant intimately. It was Rupert himself. And what really happened went something like this. That night, he'd had too much to drink at the pub, and by the time he made it home, he really had to go. And in what could be best described as drunk person's logic, decided the whole thing could go faster and easier if he just relieved himself outside. So he went along the edge of his property. But before he did, he didn't want to risk losing his phone or his belt in the dark. So he placed both of those items carefully in the greenhouse, then took a few steps to find a good spot where he could answer nature's call, and somehow lost his balance at the exact wrong moment in the exact wrong place, and fell backwards, directly, into the freshly pruned holly bush and a razor-sharp branch that just unfortunately hit him in the backside like the perfect bullseye. Not once, but twice. Because when he tried to get himself free that first time, he must have drunkenly fallen back again on that same branch in the exact same spot. Pat told the detective, if you want to confirm this theory, find that branch, test it for DNA, check it for blood. It'll be there, and it'll be Rupert's. The detective politely thanked Pat and hung up. And soon after, the case, this attempted murder case, was discreetly closed. At least she never heard anything about it ever again. And there was nothing left for Pat to do, except hope for Rupert to have a speedy recovery. For Pat, this was one of her more memorable cases. One, because it was so unusual. And two, it was an incident that turned out to be an accident. No attempted murder here, just some bum luck. And with that came hope that he'd recover, that he'd be okay. Most of Pat's cases didn't end like that. Soon there would be a whole different case. One that was the tragic reverse A case where police knew there'd been a murder. They knew who the victim was, and they knew who did it. They were just missing one crucial piece of the puzzle. Where was the body? And to find that out, they'll need Professor Wiltshire, her Mozart, her microscope, and her cat, Mickey. And you'll hear the whole story in a longer episode. It'll be the bonus episode for February. So remember to subscribe so you don't miss it via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. Until next time, nighty-night.